I think it's a very dangerous situation where people who are not elected from other countries can have that kind of impact on our parliamentary democracy.
I went to the social media companies and asked for his data and was refused access. And it surprised me that as a parent to a minor, he was 14, that I'm not allowed to see what he was looking at.
It's about saying that if these big platforms that have huge users don't comply with the Online Safety Act, then they have no right to be accessed in this country.
Lola McAvoy, Ellen Room, welcome to PoliticsJOE. How would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, now then, my name's Lola McAvoy and I am the Labour MP for Darlington. I was elected in July, so I'm one of the newbie MPs.
I'm Ellen Room, I'm a bereaved mother but campaigning for online safety.
Before we start talking about the Online Safety Act, Lola, the elephant in the room this week is what can only be called the bullying and harassment of Labour MPs, including Jess Phillips, a minister who's had her case now referred to the police. Is it acceptable not only for a social media platform to allow, but for their CEO to take part in that sort of behaviour online?
So I think it's important to say, to start, that Jess Phillips is an absolute legend. That woman has put herself in the firing line for her entire career, standing up for the voices of all women and girls to end violence against them. And she has the best track record of anyone in Parliament in actually delivering for women and girls, people who had been for generations completely ignored and ostracised in our society, and she has brought their stories to the forefront and will always advocate for them. And she is best placed to lead this government's mission to halve violence against women and girls by the end of this Parliament. In fact, I would go so far as to say her campaigning on this in opposition is what has led to our government being so determined to tackle this issue. So Jess is amazing and she is an inspiration, I think, to all parliamentarians and a lot of women up and down the country. I've been really heartened by the response in my inbox from people in Darlington, my constituency, who've just sent me things like, I'm a dad of daughters, stand up for Jess. Like, it is appalling to see her villainised like this. I think it's a very dangerous situation where people who are not elected from other countries can have that kind of impact on our parliamentary democracy. I do think it's testimony to Jess, how she's handled herself. I mean, she does not need anyone. She's rock hard. That's what I like to say. And you know, I saw her just yesterday and this morning. I've seen her. There's a debate going on as we speak about violence against women and girls. And I saw her, and she is, as ever, frank, like determined and unswayed by the threats against her. But you know, it's impossible to think that it wouldn't take its toll on a personal level. And she, like you say, is in the firing line, and we have seen the catastrophic impact of weaponising issues that people are rightly concerned about. You know, the issues that have been raised on this subject, it's harrowing and horrifying to think of, like, abuse and grooming gangs and everything that has come up. So to take an issue like that and to make a female politician the subject of your of the attacks, you know, on her and her character, I think is incredibly dangerous.
Is it acceptable for social media platforms to allow that sort of behaviour?
So social media platforms should not be allowing bullying and harassment of anybody, let alone people who are in public life because of where they have a serious threat to their own security. And that's one of the things. As a new MP, and you know, as a woman, I was quite shocked by the level of security required, and I like to think I'm quite streetwise, you know, I think I can handle myself. I am, you know, I'm past that age where I'm, you know, subject to a lot of street harassment, and I've been shocked by how vulnerable you feel when you realise that people have access to so much information about you and where you are.
Before we go into more detail about the regulation and the Online Safety Act, I'd like to ask you, Ellen, your debate has been selected for the Commons on Monday afternoon following a petition in your son's memory. Can you tell us about your son Jules and that petition?
So my son was 14, Jules, and he took his own life in April 22. At the time, the coroner didn't rule that he could be certain that he was in a suicidal mood, and I wasn't strong enough to fight it. And then in April this year, I said, okay, now let's look at social media data, because that's the one thing that the police didn't look at. The forensic system was down. And I went to the social media companies and asked for his data and was refused access. And it surprised me that as a parent to a minor, he was 14, that I'm not allowed to see what he was looking at. And I was absolutely shocked by it, that I started a petition. My petition did say that all children, whether alive or deceased, should have access to their social media. I can now see, it hadn't actually crossed my mind that the parents might be the perpetrators, and I can see now that alive children, there's a problem with potential risk from the parents. But in my case, and other parents that I've now met, where their children are deceased, I kind of think, who are we protecting? Is that the online companies? Is that the perpetrators? Why on earth can't we see what our children were looking at? Because even if I was the perpetrator, he's no longer here. I don't understand the risk. And so I campaigned, but because of the general election, it was cut short early, so I only really had 10 days to get about 126,000 signatures. Yes, it was a bit of a mission. I said to a friend, we're going to aim for this, and I said, do you want to aim for 10, which is the first threshold? And I was like, no, we're doing 100,000. I think everybody thought I was completely mad, but it gained a lot of interest.
What is it that you hope people take away from this debate? What would you like to know?
Well, the main thing that's come out of it, when the petition ended, the data bill had been dropped from the Online Safety Act. That was then released as part of the King's speech. And so there's an awful lot of MPs that are saying, well, actually the data bill will cover it. Well, it won't necessarily cover it, because in Jules's case, neither the coroner nor the police requested that information. So let's say another child dies, and unfortunately there probably will be another death of a child. If nobody in that inquest requests that data, how do we stop somebody being in the same situation I'm in, whereby they can't have access to the data? So either we need to strengthen the data bill so that safeguards it, and in every suspicious death, I'm not sure what terminology they call, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think any death of a child, you could argue, because you could argue that it is a de facto check to make sure, because what we know about social media is that there are also other parts of legislation that will mean that people have to delete records. So if it takes a long time, then the social media company and the information, by the time you get to actually pass the inquest and the request goes in from Ofcom, there is a real legitimate concern that that data might no longer exist. And I think the reason that I'm supporting Ellen on this is because it's rare in politics to have something so clearly binary, right? It is wrong that parents who want to find answers about their own children who are no longer with them can't. That is absolutely simply wrong, and it is right that parents are able to find, even if there is information or not, which in Ellen's case you don't even know.
I've always said I don't know it was social media, but I should have the right to be able to rule it out. So there was nothing offline, he wasn't bullied, there was no aware of any mental health. And so I've always said this is the only thing we haven't looked at. And it might be that it's disclosed if I did ever get access to the data, and that there isn't anything there. But I'd like the right to know, it's my child.
I'd like to talk a bit more about kind of the areas where the Online Safety Act maybe needs strengthened. Right now it's come into effect, and social media companies now have 3 months to comply with the rules from the Act. Right now the minimum age user is 13 years old. There's very little moderation on the platform. You can just scroll and you find pornographic posts, for example, which are against a breach of the new rules put in place by the Online Safety Act. What happens if Elon Musk doesn't comply with these new rules in the 3 months?
So with the Online Safety Act as it stands, there is a very significant role for the independent regulator Ofcom to have. And this is sort of the area, it's technical, but it is the area that I have been working on quite extensively. And it's around the children's codes and what is included, what needs to be risk assessed, and how we actually make sure that children are protected. There is a stipulation that very strict age verification models must be used by these platforms, and there are huge fines for breaches of it. I think in terms of how we implement it, there will be reports to Ofcom if there is no compliance, and then Ofcom will have really significant powers in law to be able to fine and to be able to take action against these companies. I think it's interesting you should mention that platform specifically, because I set up an online safety forum in Darlington. So in Darlington, in the campaign, I was knocking on doors, obviously, as par for the course or a candidate, and online safety was the big unifying issue between every demographic, along with the cost of living crisis that was coming up across the town. So whether it was grandparents saying, my 9-year-old knows how to work my TV better than I do, or my 9-year-old grandchild knows how to work my TV better than I do, or whether it was parents telling me that their child was refusing to go to school because they'd been bullied so badly online, or if it was other children who had spent lockdown really getting into these games and were now struggling to come off them and spent all of their free time on these games talking to strangers, and they didn't know how to make sure that they were safe online. So as a result of those conversations, I said that I would try and do everything I could to tackle online safety for children. And so I set up this children's online safety forum in Darlington, focused on year 10s, brought them together, 2 children from every school in the town, brought them together. And I think I'm not that old, right? I think I know a bit about digital. I know, I've grown up with social media platforms. I was absolutely horrified with what they said. So they were saying that it is commonplace for them to have seen images of people they know that person, the subject of the image, would not have wanted them to see. Now, for me, if you think back to when we were at school, 14, it's a very difficult time. Your hormones are raging. You don't know what you're going to be putting online, and then for somebody's whole school life and their life outside to be permanently affected because of the vast communications network that you can have online is absolutely wrong. So there's that issue about peer-to-peer bullying that is something that I am very keen to ensure is at the forefront of Ofcom and the government's mind when we're implementing this Act. But there's also some of the functionalities. So with the Online Safety Act, there's rightly a huge focus on illegal harms. So that's things like access to pornography, access to illegal content. There's a secondary focus on things that could be harmful to children, and I want that section to be strengthened. So I think there are some functionalities, like on certain platforms, where you can switch your live location on. Now, children are the prolific users of these platforms. Live location given to everybody who is one of your contacts on the platform is dangerous when it comes to the access to bullying and stalking of peer-to-peer. So I think that functionality in of itself, even though it's not sharing illegal content, needs to be included, really. Things like that.
Given that the UK Parliament couldn't even get Elon Musk to appear before a select committee, do you have faith that Ofcom would be able to effectively enforce compliance?
I think the proof's in the pudding, right? So do I have faith? Yeah, I do, actually. We are the oldest democracy in the world. We are committed to protecting our children, and if there's a breach of the law, then we'll use the full force of the law to deliver on that.
If compliance doesn't occur, should the UK government consider banning these platforms?
I think I think that's what it's about, right? It's about saying that if these big platforms that have huge users don't comply with the Online Safety Act, then they have no right to be accessed in this country. So I think that's what the law's about.
And talking about strengthening the Online Safety Act, you've been campaigning for Jules Law. Can you tell us about what that would involve and how it would have helped you?
From my point of view, access to his online data, would have potentially given me answers. And as I mentioned before, if a child dies and a parent can't get access to it, it's that left unknown sort of thought in your back of the mind of, was he being stalked? You hear so much about sextortion. Was he being blackmailed? I just don't know. And I think all of that has been playing on my mind. And maybe naively, before Jules died, I didn't know as much about social media. I certainly have learned a lot in the last 6 months. And from now knowing how children are affected, I think social media is horrific, and the things they can see and the things that they have access to is just not age appropriate. And I didn't know what age Jules got his first accounts. I found out this morning, actually, he was on age 11. Well, I didn't know at 11 he had a social media account. And when he joined, for example, TikTok, I initially, as did many of my friends' parents, children's parents, we just thought they were silly TikTok dances. It was a bit of fun. It was during lockdown. We thought he was just having a laugh and there were silly dance challenges. Naively, I now know that that isn't the case. And the harmful, dangerous material that is on these social media sites that children are accessing, if I knew that now, he wouldn't be on any of them. Not at all.
In November, Technology Secretary Peter Kyle trailed banning social media use for under 16, saying it was on the table. Is that something that you think the government should consider?
So I think in Australia, they've pushed for banning under 16s from social media, and I think it's a very difficult thing to deliver. What I am really focused on is making sure that where children are using these platforms, those platforms are safe for children. So the way that I like to explain it to people is, you've got a child, you take him to soft play, right? You chaperone that child, you're in the ball pit with them. They are a young child, only young children are allowed in that ball pit. Then they get a bit older, you take them to a climbing frame, you watch them. Only a certain age group of those children can use the climbing frame. Then they get a bit older and they can go on a roller coaster, and then they get older and they can go out on their own. And I think really we need to be thinking about it like that. What's appropriate for a 13-year-old is not appropriate for an 11 or 10-year-old. All 10 and 11-year-olds could be very different depending on their life experience, even just depending on where they are in their sibling hierarchy. You know, the eldest child or the youngest child will be very different in terms of how the things they've been exposed to anyway. So it is a complicated thing to navigate. What I want to make sure is that the platforms themselves are taking very seriously their duty under this legislation to prevent the harm that is coming on them at the moment. So at the moment, children can see unvetted access to anything they search for. I mean, I said to these young people in Darlington, have you ever seen some disturbing, I use the word disturbing content that made you feel uncomfortable that you didn't search for? And they all said yeah. They all said yeah. So the idea that the social media platforms are already protecting children is for the birds. I mean, we have to legislate on this. The risk assessment part of Ofcom's duties has to be really, really tight to make sure that we get it right first time.
I personally, just to add to that, I think there needs to be an overarching duty of care with regards to these social media companies. So there is actually accountability from somebody in the companies that if they don't do it, then there's a real issue. And there isn't that in the online safety at the moment. So it needs to be strengthened massively.
We've seen Mark Zuckerberg in the recent days say that fact-checking moderation will be replaced. Are you worried that an increasing trend in deregulation of social media platforms will affect children negatively?
So obviously there are concerns about that announcement. I don't think anybody would not be concerned by that announcement. Fake news is prolific and a huge problem for democracies and for safety of people. And I think children have been really badly let down. So there's no other sphere that you can articulate where children are so vulnerable that is completely unregulated. The legislation has lagged way behind where the social media advances have come in, and this is about readdressing that balance to make sure that we get it right to protect children. I think in terms of that specific case about fake news, the government are in conversations to make sure that to see how that will affect the UK. I think it is better to have those fake news flags and to say, you know, the fact check element of it is a good thing. You know, people only read the headline, and we know that a lot of online platforms are using, they call it clickbait, don't they? Because that's how they make their income revenue. So you can put a really sort of attention-grabbing headline when the facts beneath it might not be read, and often it's a real problem. And I think we've seen that just this week, really. These are very complicated, difficult issues with real people's lives affected in a horrific way, and we have to be really careful about how disinformation is spread.
You say the government are in conversations over fact-checking on Facebook. Is that in conversations with Facebook?
So I don't know any further information about it.
No worries.
I am not party, as a lowly backbencher, I am not party to conversations at that level.
My final question to both of you is, what is at stake if the government fails to take further action on this issue?
So I think the government are determined to take action on this issue. The Online Safety Act is coming in. What's important here is that we get it right first time. So the reason I'm campaigning on it is because I was elected to do that. I feel very passionately that I want to use my time in this place and my privilege to make sure that it has an impact on the lives of children in my constituency and up and down the country. I think the work that I'm doing affects everybody, and I really think we have the opportunity to get it right. I think a lot of the work will have a very significant impact to reduce the harms to children. I think there are some slightly grey areas that we can strengthen, and I'm hopeful and confident that it will have the desired effect, which is to make sure that children are no longer left so vulnerable to sort of online disturbing content. So I think the current legislation as it stands will go most of the way to protecting children online. I think Ellen here and her amazing campaign and strength is testimony to the real need that we have in this country to protect children. And, you know, I want to thank you for all of your work. You're absolutely incredible. Oh. You really are. It's unbelievable to think that somebody who's gone through what you've gone through, which is unimaginable, would be able to stand here and advocate continuously about this. And I just think absolute kudos to you. You're amazing.
Thank you.
It's been a real privilege to work with the bereaved families, and I don't think it's escaped many people in the country how amazing this group is to advocate for change. I do think this legislation will go most of the way. I think it is really important that the wider issues around the content that they're exposed to is also taken into account. So that's why this government have got a commitment to supporting mental health as well, and making sure that those services are fit for purpose.
I think I've met Peter Carl and Melanie Dawes, CEO of Ofcom, a couple of times. Melanie is absolutely driven to do this. I'm looking forward to them actually enforcing it. So if we're sort of waiting till April, and I know it's the illegal harms that are coming out first and not necessarily the harmful ones that are being dealt with, the sooner they start enforcing these things and start making changes, because the social media companies we've met with, they're just sort of waiting to be told what to be done. And I think the social media companies could actually step up and say, well, actually, let's do this ahead of time, a bit like Instagram has done with the Teens account. The problem is that, you know, Jules wasn't his right age on his social media accounts, and until they get that bit right, they're not actually tackling the teenagers that are affected.